What happens when a vibrant democracy suddenly falls silent under the shadow of military boots? How does a nation, rich in culture and hope, descend into decades of secrecy, fear, and repression? Brazil's military dictatorship, spanning from 1964 to 1985, was more than just a chapter in history. It was a dark saga filled with untold stories of power, pain, and resistance. Behind the official narratives and guarded archives lie chilling tales of disappearances, censorship, and brutal repression. But how did this regime rise with such swift precision? What secrets were hidden in the silence? And what struggles did the people face to reclaim their voice and democracy? Join us as we unravel the gripping story of Brazil as military dictatorship, a story of secrets buried deep, voices silenced, and a nation's relentless fight for justice and truth. Imagine a country standing at a crossroads, its future uncertain, its people divided, and its leaders haunted by fear. Brazil in the early 1960s was exactly that, a nation simmering with tension, where whispers of revolution collided with the looming specter of Cold War paranoia. At the helm was President João Goulart, a man whose progressive ideas ignited hope in some but triggered alarm in others. Goulart sought to reshape Brazil with bold reforms, land redistribution, workers' rights, and social programs aimed at uplifting millions. But to powerful landowners, industrialists, and the military elite, these changes looked like the first steps toward communism. The Cold War's icy grip extended deep into Latin America, and Brazil was no exception. U.S. officials watched with growing unease, fearing that Brazil could become the next domino to fall under Soviet influence. Behind closed doors, alliances were forged, plans whispered, and the stage was set for a drastic intervention. Meanwhile, Brazilian society was fracturing. Urban elites and rural peasants lived worlds apart. Street protests erupted, student activists clashed with police, and political speeches grew more fiery and divisive. The media painted a nation on edge, teetering between democracy and chaos. But what was the tipping point? How did fear, ambition, and ideology converge to spark a military coup that would shatter Brazil's democratic experiment? In this charged atmosphere of suspicion and unrest, the military, once guardians of the nation, prepared to seize control. What followed would be decades of silence, secrets, and struggle, forever changing Brazil's destiny. The night of March 31, 1964, was cloaked in uncertainty. In homes across Brazil, few knew that the country's fate was about to be violently rewritten. Behind the scenes, a carefully orchestrated plan was unfolding, a plan hatched by generals, politicians, and shadowy influencers who believed Brazil was on the brink of disaster. President João Goulart had become a lightning rod for controversy. His attempts at sweeping reforms had alienated powerful factions, and rumors of communist infiltration fueled widespread paranoia. The military, long seen as the nation's protector, declared that drastic action was necessary to save Brazil from chaos and from itself. But was the coup truly a spontaneous act of patriotism, or a calculated power grab backed by foreign interests eager to stamp out any hint of leftist influence? As troops mobilized, tanks rolled through the streets of Brasilia and São Paulo. The skies buzzed with military aircraft, and radio stations were seized to broadcast messages of order and security. Opposition leaders were rounded up, Congress was dissolved, and the Constitution was suspended. Within hours, the democratic fabric of Brazil was torn apart. The military declared a revolution that promised stability but unleashed an era of repression and fear. Political opponents vanished into the shadows, their fates unknown. Censorship blanketed the nation, silencing dissent. Yet, amid the turmoil, pockets of resistance began to form. Citizens grappled with shock and disbelief. Some hoped for a swift return to normalcy. Others feared they had entered a nightmare with no end in sight. What secret deals paved the way for this swift takeover? Who were the silent architects pulling the strings? And how did a country, proud of its democracy, become shackled by the iron grip of a dictatorship? This was the dawn of Brazil's military regime, a regime that would rule with an iron fist for 21 years, leaving scars that still haunt the nation today. As Brazil's military rulers tightened their grip, the veneer of order masked a terrifying undercurrent, a ruthless system designed to crush dissent and silence any spark of resistance. The democratic freedoms Brazilians once took for granted were methodically stripped away, piece by piece, through a series of draconian decrees known as the Institutional Acts. Among these, one stands out in infamy. Institutional Act No. 5, or AI-5, unleashed in December 1968. It was not merely a law, it was a weapon of fear, granting the regime unchecked powers that would turn Brazil into a labyrinth of terror and secrecy. AI-5 suspended habeas corpus, meaning citizens could be arrested, tortured, and held indefinitely without trial. It shut down Congress, closed universities, banned political parties, and censored newspapers, books, music, anything that dared challenge the regime's narrative. In an instant, Brazil transformed into a silent country where whispers of opposition could cost lives. Behind closed doors, the secret police and intelligence agencies operated like shadowy monsters. The notorious DOI-CODE, Brazil's intelligence and repression agency, became the regime's ruthless enforcer. Torture chambers hidden in plain sight, like the chillingly nicknamed Tutoia Hilton, became sites of unimaginable cruelty. Prisoners were subjected to physical and psychological torment designed to break their spirits and erase their voices forever. But how did such horrors go unnoticed by so many? How did entire communities live in fear yet hold onto hope? Families vanished without explanation. The disappeared became ghosts haunting the conscience of the nation. And yet, the regime's brutality also sparked quiet acts of defiance. Underground networks smuggled news, clandestine meetings plotted resistance, and brave souls risked everything to expose the truth. What drove the military to unleash such merciless repression? Who were the victims? And how did Brazil's society endure the suffocating silence? This chapter reveals the dark machinery behind the dictatorship, where power was absolute and silence was deadly. Imagine waking up every day in a country where your words, your actions, even your thoughts could betray you. A place where the streets you walk, the conversations you have, the books you read, all are watched, monitored, and controlled. This was the grim reality for millions of Brazilians living under the military dictatorship. Fear was the currency of everyday life. Neighbors whispered anxiously behind closed doors. Families lived with the constant dread that a knock at the door in the dead of night could mean disappearance, or worse. Children learned early not to ask questions. Parents silenced their own fears to protect them. The regime's eyes were everywhere, in schools, workplaces, public squares, and homes. Censorship strangled creativity and truth. Newspapers, television, and radio spewed government-approved propaganda, erasing voices of dissent. Songs were banned, books burned, and artists censored. Yet, beneath the surface, an underground pulse of resistance beat strong. Secretly, pamphlets circulated, forbidden music played on hidden radios, and graffiti appeared as silent cries for freedom. The disappeared, men, women, students, activists, became shadows in Brazil's collective memory. Families, desperate for answers, faced stone walls of silence and denial. Torture centers operated in the shadows, where screams were muffled and human rights trampled. The regime's brutality was relentless, but so too was the courage of those who dared to resist. Resistance took many forms, from secret meetings of political groups to daring escapes abroad, to the subtle rebellion in art and literature. Ordinary citizens became heroes in their own right, risking everything to fight an invisible war against oppression. How did people hold on to hope when the very air seemed thick with danger? What fueled their bravery when the consequences were often fatal? And how did this silent struggle eventually help to crack the regime's iron grip? In this chapter, we step inside the lives of those who endured, resisted, and refused to be silenced in one of Brazil's darkest eras. In the midst of repression and fear, Brazil's military regime unveiled a dazzling promise: the Brazilian miracle. It was a story the government told the world, a story of rapid economic growth, shining skyscrapers, and sprawling highways. But behind this glittering facade lay a complex tale of ambition, sacrifice, and deep contradictions. From the late 1960s into the early 1970s, Brazil's economy soared. Annual growth rates reached staggering heights, industrial production boomed, and foreign investment flooded in. For many, the regime's economic policy seemed like a miracle, a transformation of Brazil into a modern, prosperous powerhouse. But was this miracle too good to be true? Beneath the surface, millions of Brazilians faced a harsher reality. While the cities glittered with new wealth, rural areas and the urban poor saw little benefit. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. Landowners grew richer even as peasants were displaced. Workers faced harsh conditions, low wages, and few rights. The regime's focus on heavy industry and infrastructure masked a growing debt crisis and inflation that would eventually choke the economy. Environmental destruction and exploitation of natural resources went largely unchecked, and the political repression that sustained this economic model left no room for protest or demands for fairness. The Brazilian miracle was a double-edged sword, a triumph of economic modernization built on the backs of the marginalized and enforced by fear. It bought the regime time, masked its cruelty, and silenced many critics. But this fragile prosperity could not last. As the 1970s drew to a close, the cracks began to show. Economic slowdown, growing unrest, and international pressure foreshadowed the regime's eventual unraveling. What secret deals fueled the economic boom? How did the regime maintain control despite mounting inequalities? And how did the people's struggle for justice continue even amid apparent progress? This chapter uncovers the complex truths behind Brazil's miracle, a tale of dazzling success shadowed by deep sacrifice. As the 1970s waned, the unyielding iron grip of Brazil's military regime began to show signs of wear. What once seemed like an unstoppable fortress of control now faced the relentless forces of change, and the whispers of dissent grew louder than ever. Beneath the surface of apparent stability, cracks deepened. The economy that had dazzled with the Brazilian miracle faltered, inflation soared, and poverty gnawed at the margins of society. The regime's promise of prosperity could no longer mask the widening inequality and growing dissatisfaction. But it was not just economic woes that shook the dictatorship. A wave of courage surged from unexpected places: churches, universities, unions, and communities, where ordinary Brazilians dared to demand justice, freedom, and an end to repression. The regime, sensing the tide turning, cautiously began a process it called abertura, political opening. It was a delicate dance, easing controls just enough to appease growing unrest but not so much as to lose power entirely. This opening was a double-edged sword. While censorship loosened and political prisoners were released under the controversial amnesty law of 1979, the military still wielded brutal power behind the scenes. Old wounds festered, and the ghosts of the disappeared haunted the nation's conscience. Dissenters organized, risking imprisonment and worse, forging alliances across ideological divides. The seeds of Brazil's rebirth were planted in clandestine meetings, protests, and strikes, even as the regime tightened surveillance and intimidation. How did a nation, long silenced, find its voice again? What sacrifices fueled this fragile opening? And could a government so steeped in repression truly embrace change, Or was the slow demise merely a prelude to a more tumultuous reckoning? This chapter reveals the tension-filled years when hope and fear clashed, setting the stage for Brazil's dramatic journey back to democracy. After more than 2 decades under the shadow of military rule, Brazil stood at a precipice, a nation desperate for change but haunted by the ghosts of its past. The years leading up to 1985 were charged with tension, hope, and uncertainty. How do you dismantle a regime that has ruled with an iron fist for so long? And how do you rebuild a democracy shattered by repression and fear? The military, once confident in its absolute control, faced mounting pressure from within and beyond Brazil's borders. Economic crises battered the country, social movements swelled, and an increasingly vocal civil society demanded a return to democratic rule. But the generals were reluctant to let go, fearful of losing their power and accountability. The 1984 campaign for Direitos Já, direct elections now, ignited the nation's collective spirit. Millions flooded the streets, chanting for the right to choose their leaders freely. Yet, despite the overwhelming public demand, direct presidential elections were blocked by the military-controlled Congress, forcing an indirect vote. When the Electoral College chose Tancredo Neves as the first civilian president in decades, a fragile hope blossomed. But tragedy struck. Neves fell gravely ill before his inauguration and died, plunging the country into uncertainty once again. Vice President José Sarney assumed office, symbolizing a complex transition, civilian leadership under the lingering shadow of military influence. This was not a clean break, but a painstaking, imperfect process. The military maintained significant control behind the scenes, and the wounds of dictatorship, torture survivors, disappeared activists, and censored voices remained raw and unresolved. Yet Brazilians dared to dream again. Newspapers reopened, political parties flourished, and citizens reclaimed their streets and voices. The foundations of a new democracy were laid, but the legacy of repression cast a long shadow over the nation's future. How did Brazil navigate this delicate path from dictatorship to democracy? What compromises were made, and what battles lay ahead to confront the past? This chapter explores the turbulent, hopeful, and sometimes painful journey toward reclaiming freedom. Beneath the surface of Brazil, as newfound democracy, lurked a darkness that refused to fade, a web of secrets, lies, and silences that stretched back through the years of military rule. For decades, families searched in vain for answers about their missing loved ones. Survivors of torture bore scars both visible and invisible, their stories buried beneath layers of fear and repression. The dictatorship had left behind a haunting legacy: clandestine prisons, hidden cemeteries, and files locked away in secret vaults. Who were the architects of cruelty? What atrocities were concealed behind the regime's polished public image? And why did so many remain silent, even as the country moved forward? The struggle for truth was a perilous journey. Efforts to investigate abuses were met with fierce resistance from those who once wielded power. Military officials, government loyalists, and shadowy networks determined to protect their secrets. The Amnesty Law of 1979, initially hailed as a step toward reconciliation, became a double-edged sword, shielding many perpetrators from justice while silencing victims. Yet the hunger for justice could not be extinguished. Human rights activists, journalists, and the families of the disappeared formed a relentless front, demanding truth commissions, public hearings, and recognition of the crimes committed in the name of national security. This chapter dives into the emotional and often dangerous fight to break the silence. It reveals stories of courage, of those who risked everything to expose the truth, and the societal struggle to confront a painful past. How did a nation reconcile with the horrors hidden in its history? What price was paid for the silence? And can justice truly heal wounds this deep? In uncovering these secrets, Brazil continues to grapple with its identity, seeking not just to remember, but to learn heal, and ensure such darkness never returns. In the years after the fall of the military dictatorship, Brazil found itself wrestling not only with political transition but with the very soul of its identity. How do you remember a past stained by repression, fear, and silence? How do a nation's artists, writers, and filmmakers confront the shadows of brutality and censorship that once suffocated the truth? This chapter reveals the powerful resurgence of Brazil's cultural landscape as it became the battleground for memory and reckoning. Through evocative films, piercing literature, and provocative public debates, Brazilians began to peel back the layers of their collective amnesia. Art became more than expression. It became resistance, remembrance, and a demand for justice. Movies like Pra Frente Brasil and O Que É Isso, Companheiro broke through decades of silence, confronting audiences with raw depictions of torture, political imprisonment, and betrayal. Writers wove narratives that gave voice to the disappeared, the tortured, and the survivors, stories that challenged official histories and forced the nation to look in the mirror. Public debate ignited fierce discussions. What should be remembered? Who should be honored or condemned? How do you reconcile a society deeply divided by its past? The media, once controlled by the regime, transformed into a platform for critical inquiry and vibrant discourse. Museums and memorials rose, preserving the painful lessons for future generations. But this cultural reckoning was not without controversy. Some sought to bury the past under a veil of forgetfulness, fearing the reopening of old wounds. Others demanded truth and accountability, arguing that healing was impossible without confronting the full extent of the regime's crimes. In this ongoing dialogue between memory and silence, Brazil's democracy was tested and strengthened. The struggle to remember became a fight to define what it means to be Brazilian in a nation scarred by dictatorship, yet resilient in its quest for justice. What role does art play in shaping national memory? Can storytelling unlock wounds too deep for politics alone? This chapter explores the fiery crossroads where culture meets conscience, illuminating Brazil's path toward truth and reconciliation. More than 3 decades after the fall of the military dictatorship, Brazil still wrestles with the shadows cast by those dark years. The lessons from this turbulent chapter of history ripple far beyond its borders, echoing through the corridors of power, civil society, and the hearts of its people. This chapter peels back the layers to reveal how the military era shaped modern Brazil, not only in its politics and economy, but in the very fabric of its national identity. The scars of repression have left deep imprints. A cautious democracy still haunted by the fragility of freedom, institutions struggling to hold power accountable, and a society still divided by memories of fear and resistance. How has Brazil's painful past shaped its present struggles with corruption, inequality, and political polarization? What lessons does the world learn from a nation that survived dictatorship, yet still battles the ghosts of authoritarianism? Brazil's experience serves as a stark warning and a beacon of hope. It reveals the perils of unchecked power and the vital importance of vigilance, transparency, and civic courage. It underscores how democracy is not a given, but a fragile, hard-won prize. Yet, amid ongoing challenges, Brazil's vibrant civil society, courageous activists, and thriving cultural movements demonstrate resilience and determination to build a future rooted in justice, memory, and human rights. This chapter explores the enduring legacy of the military dictatorship, how the echoes of its secrets and silences continue to shape a nation striving to reconcile with its past while forging a path forward. It asks, can Brazil's story inspire other nations wrestling with authoritarian shadows? And will the lessons learned here guard against history's darkest chapters repeating? In understanding Brazil's journey from darkness to democracy, we uncover universal truths about power, resistance, and the relentless human quest for freedom. The story of Brazil's military dictatorship is not just a tale from the past. It's a mirror held up to the present. It's a haunting reminder of how easily freedom can be stolen and how fiercely it must be defended. The voices of the disappeared still echo in Brazil's streets, in its songs, in its films, and in the hearts of those who dare to remember. But history does not end. It waits. It waits to be uncovered, retold, and learned from. So the question remains, what would you have done if you lived through those years? And perhaps more urgently, what will you do now to protect democracy, truth, and justice in your own corner of the world? If this journey moved you, challenged you, or opened your eyes to a part of history too often silenced, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to Tales Beyond Time for more untold stories from the past that still shape our world today. Like this video if you believe history must be remembered, no matter how dark. Comment below. What struck you the most about Brazil's dictatorship? Do you see echoes of this past in other places today? Share this episode, because history, when told, can spark awareness, reflection, and even resistance. Together, let's keep the truth alive.